In this video, we'll be adding the range combat to our player, giving you the option to choose between melee and range attacks. To begin, let's download the animation we'll use for the range attack. You can use your own animation, but I'll be using one from Mixamo. Right here, I'll set the frames to 60 and choose the without skin for the skin option. Once you have the animation imported into Unity, let's set the animation type to humanoid. I'll change the name to range attack to make it easier to find later. Just like with any other animation, we'll tick the loop time and bake into pose options in all these sections. Also, make sure the based on option is set to original. As a side note, I'll rename both the range and melee attack animations to keep things organized. Now let's add the range projectile. For now we'll use basic shapes, so we'll add a sphere game object and set the scale to 0.5. Tick the trigger box in the sphere collider component, and next we'll add the rigid body component, and there are no further changes needed here. After that, it's time to add the script to our projectile. Name the script target enemy and open it in Visual Studio. In this script, we'll need several variables. Declare a private transform called target and another private transform called original target. Add a private rigid body variable named the RB and a private stats variable called player stats. Finally, create a public float and call it projectile speed. In the start method, set the original target to the value of target. This variable ensures that the projectile can still target the enemy even if the target variable is set to null by the other scripts. To find the player stats, set it to GameObject.find with tag player.getComponentStats. Lastly, set the rigid body to getComponent rigid body. In the update method, start with an if statement checking if target is not equal to null, and if it's not null, create a vector3 variable called direction and set it to the target.position minus transform.position. Then, set the velocity of the rigid body to direction.normalize times projectile speed. Next, add an else if statement checking if the original target is not equal to null, and if it's not null, create another vector3 variable called direction, but this time set it to the original target.position. Set the velocity of the rigid body to direction.normalized times projectile speed. Finally, add an else statement to destroy the game object. Outside of the update method, create a public void called setTarget that takes the transform parameter called newTarget. In this method, simply set the target to newTarget. We'll call this method later in the combat script. Additionally, create a private void onTriggerEnter method. In this method, add an if statement to check if the target is not equal to null, and if the reference equals other.gameObject and target.gameObject. If both conditions are true, get the stats component of the target by using target.gameObject.getComponentStats. We'll call the damage function in that script, targeting the enemy based on the player's damage. Lastly, we'll go ahead and destroy the game object. Repeat the same logic for the original target in another if statement. Back in Unity, set the projectile speed to 10 for now, but feel free to adjust this to your liking. Rename the projectile and create a prefab of it. To implement the combat script, duplicate the melee combat script and rename it to range combat. Open it in Visual Studios and make sure that the public class is set to the same name that you renamed it to in Unity. First, rename all the variables that contain melee into range. After you've renamed all the variables and made necessary changes, copy and paste the header and change the name to range projectile variables. Here we'll add a public game object called attack projectile, a public transform named attack spawn point, and a private game object called spawn projectile. Scroll down to the range attack method, which will be used in an animation event. Remove this line of code and instead we'll set spawn projectile to instantiate attack projectile, attack spawn point.position, and attack spawn point.rotation. Create a variable called target enemy script and set it to spawn projectile.getComponent target enemy. Following that, add an if statement checking if the target enemy script is not equal to null, and if it's not, call the setTarget function and pass the target enemy.transform as the parameter. In Unity, go to the range animation and scroll down to the events tab. Just like with the melee combat, find the point in the animation where you want to call the range attack function. For example, I'll choose the moment when the character's arm is straight as he's about to attack. In the function field, write range attack, and for the object, add the range combat script. Click apply and save the changes. Finally, go to your player and drag the range combat script onto it. In the inspector, drag the range projectile prefab and we'll go ahead and create a spawn point. Locate the right arm in the hierarchy and create an empty game object. Position it just outside and a bit further than the hand, then drag it into the inspector as the attack spawn point. Additionally, change the stopping distance in the movement script to a higher value, such as 5, to give it that range distance. Before we go ahead and test everything, we need to make one more small addition to our movement script. Open it in Visual Studio and scroll down to the part where it checks if the target is not null. Create an if statement to check if the position.y is greater than 1. In this case, set the target enemy to null. That's it for all the changes. Back in Unity, when I press play, you'll see when you click on the enemy, your character runs towards them, stops at a certain range, and shoots a projectile during the animation. Specifically, the projectile is shot when the character's arm is straight. You may notice that the projectile is going towards the enemy's feet. That is because the origin of the player is set at its feet. There are ways to work around this by creating an empty game object and attaching all the scripts to it, with the player model being positioned in the center as a child. However, this would require some coding changes. Another option I can suggest is creating a child game object of the player and setting that as the target enemy, but this would also require adjustments in the code. Feel free to experiment with these ideas, but for now, I'm satisfied with the projectile going towards the enemy and taking damage. That is all for this video. If you found this tutorial helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.